In this tutorial, I'm going to provide an overview for how you can use Conveyor to import Rhino 7 subd objects into Revit. A subd object in Rhino is a type of object that allows users to define what's called a subdivision surface. And this is a method for representing a smooth surface using a control cage or control network of polygons. And so this is a subd surface that I have sitting inside of Rhino 7 at the moment. If I click it and activate the control points, you can see that there are a set of controls here that are defining a very coarse control net of polygons. And using a set of refinement schemes inside of Rhino, the subd surface interpolates and describes a smooth, continuous object within this control cage. And this allows for all sorts of fun modeling techniques. You can start to describe very efficiently very complex smooth surfaces using a set of very simple controls. It makes it very popular for character modeling, for example, and these types of techniques are very common in entertainment software like Maya and other mesh-based modeling platforms. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use Conveyor to take this subd object and bring it into the Revit environment so you could start to document this type of shape. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to set out a Conveyor setup command and I'll do Imperial here, and it's going to generate my Conveyor layer structure, and it's also going to activate my Conveyor assignment interface. So with a subd object, the way that we're going to bring these over into Revit is going to be using a set of mesh classifications. It's going to use a very similar algorithm that Conveyor uses to post-process and convert meshes into Revit, since this is inherently, in some ways, a kind of a mesh-based modeling technique. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this object and I'm going to assign it to the meshes category, and the type is going to be a generic model. And I'm going to go ahead and save it. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into Revit, and Revit with Conveyor installed, you'll have the Proving Ground tab. I'm going to activate the Conveyor interface here, and I'm going to navigate to my subd example, which has that object in it. I'm going to hit open, and Conveyor is going to identify that this is a subd object, and I have one available to import, and so I'm just going to hit load objects. So this is now going to go through the process of processing and loading that subd object, and what the resultant import is going to be is a family object that has the subd object sitting inside of it, and it's using the underlying mesh of the subd object to represent it. And like you may have seen in other tutorials about Conveyor, we're using a set of post-processing methods that allow us to represent meshes in Revit using clean hidden line techniques. So this is a mesh. If I go to a shaded mode, we can start to see the level of meshing that's occurring on this object. We can see the faces of the different mesh facets here. So, in a shaded view, it's not going to look perfectly smooth, but when you're in hidden line, it makes for a nice hidden line representation. Now, there are ways for us to further refine the look of these subd objects, which I'll talk about now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into Rhino, and I'm going to do a couple of modifications to my mesh. And one of those is I'm going to just do some weird stuff here. I'm going to take my face here and just kind of pull it out a bit. So I kind of have now an extension. Kind of gives you an idea of how powerful subds are, and that you can start to make these modifications to a typology like this very easily. It's almost like sculpting some clay, or doing some kind of just molding of geometry in a very free-form like manner. Extremely powerful, and McNeil's done an excellent job of creating tools for manipulating these shapes. So you can select faces. We can do stuff like pull this stuff out, extend and stretch these shapes. If we were to do something like this with normal NURBS modeling and try to maintain kind of the tangential relationships between surfaces and such, it would be extremely excruciating. So it's great that McNeil's starting to introduce this stuff into Rhino. So I've made a couple of adjustments to my subd object here. I'm going to go ahead and hit save. And I'm going to go ahead and jump back into Revit, and I want to update my shape. So I'm going to go here and just do a refresh, and we're going to see that, hey, we have an update to the shape that's needed. But I also want the shape to come in with a more refined mesh. And so we do have import settings for meshes that can change up the level of resolution of our subd mesh. So if I go to my options here, you'll see that we have a new section called subdivisions. And by default, what it's doing is it's subdividing the refinement scheme by a level of 3. So it's taking the coarse mesh and doing 3 levels of subdivision to get the smoother shape. I'm going to increase that to 5, which is going to increase the level of subdivisions and therefore increase the level of smoothness that the mesh object has when we import. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And I'm going to go ahead and load my Rhino objects in. And so what we're going to see here is Conveyor go through a process of updating our mesh family object. And it's also going to load in a much more finer mesh shape as a result. And so you can see that we updated the object. We have that a kind of extruded extension that I pulled out and adjusted some of the faces, and it's also giving us a much smoother resolution mesh because we increased the subdivision amount on import. So these types of meshes are and objects inside of Revit are useful for perhaps having some representation of complex objects like this in your documentation set. These do cut. If I go to a level here, you can see that it is cutting in my plan view. They do appear in our elevational views, and this allows for this type of object to kind of exist among other Revit geometries, such that you can have it there for reference. These are meshes, so applying materials to them is not quite possible with Revit. So don't think about this perhaps as a technique that you're going to bring them into Revit and do renderings with UV, all the proper UV mapping and such. This is really meant for bringing in objects for quick representations and documentations of shapes that would otherwise be very problematic to model in Revit and or document in Rhino using the kind of methods available in Revit. So hopefully this was a useful overview. We're able to go from this idea of a subdivision object, a new object type in Rhino 7, and using Conveyor, bring those objects into the Revit environment and have them be something that can be used in the production process.